How to debunk the Trinity within 30 seconds.
All right, let's see it.
Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all 100% God. That means they should all have 100% attributes of God. So I have a question for you Christians. Do you say Jesus is independent on God the Father, or is he dependent on God the Father? Because if he is independent from God the Father, that means you ultimately have two independent existences, meaning two gods. And if he's dependent on God the Father, then he can't be God, because God is 100% independent.
So this is actually how the doctrine of the Logos originated. It is a borrowing from a kind of Stoic Middle Platonic idea of God's mediation with the material world, because in those Greek philosophical schools, the divine was entirely separate from and could not interact with the material world. And so the idea developed within Stoicism and then was picked up within Middle Platonism that it was God's rationality that was expressed, that was the means of interaction with the material world. There were two different concepts of the Logos, which could mean rationality, it could mean reason, it could mean word, it could mean a lot of different things, which is why a lot of people today prefer to just transliterate it rather than translate it. But there was the concept of the Logos endiathetos and the Logos prophorikos. And the Logos endiathetos was the innate Logos. This was God's thinking, rationality inside God's own mind. And then once it was expressed in speech, it was the expressed Logos, the Logos prophorikos, and it was separate from God. And so this is why when we look at Philo, who's writing during and after the life of Jesus, Philo talks about the God who appears to Moses and to others being the Logos and being, quote, a second God. And then by the time we get to the Gospel of John, you have something very similar. The Word was with God, and this could be understood as the Logos endiathetos. And then the Logos was divine, and it was through the Logos that all things were created, which is that idea of the Logos prophorikos, the expressed Logos, being the means of divine interaction with and creation of the material world. And this is what we see in Justin Martyr as well, the earliest Christian who's talking about the Logos. And Justin Martyr is emphasizing the distinction of the Logos prophorikos from God, and refers to that expressed Logos, the one interacting in the world, the one appearing to Moses and to others, as another God. And Justin has to defend that notion of another God to Trypho, who is a Jewish person who's like, wait, you can't have another God. And Justin says, you can have another God. And then we get to Athenagoras and we get to Theophilus of Antioch, who are also appealing to a Middle Platonic / Stoic notion of the Logos, only they're starting to emphasize the unity rather than the distinction of the two. And by the time you get to Irenaeus, Irenaeus's main opponents are the Gnostics, who are deeply embedded in Greek philosophy. And so Irenaeus is wary of what's going on with the Greek side of the Logos doctrine. And so Irenaeus is pushing back against this and saying, no, they're entirely unified. The Logos can't depart from God. And the metaphors that the earlier apologists use were the idea of fire kindled from fire, and light coming off of a source, and this concept of begetting. And Irenaeus is like, no, God is everywhere. You cannot depart from God. You cannot leave from God. And so the Logos and God are unified at all times. And so there was this attempt to try to square this circle of the Logos being both independent and dependent. And it's not until Irenaeus that we get away from the more independent concept of the Logos prophorikos and get to this idea that there's still only one God, and the Logos in some sense is an expression of God that is not fully independent from God. And the philosophical implications of all of this would be further fleshed out as the Trinity begins to develop more fully into the 3rd, the 4th, and finally the 5th centuries CE, which is where we get the hypostatic union, which is going to be most relevant to the rest of this discussion. But if you would like more academic discussions of what's going on with the early doctrine of the Logos in Philo, in John, in the Apologists, in Irenaeus, here are some publications that you can check out that I think do a wonderful job of explaining what's going on.
The idea that you can defeat the Trinity in 30 seconds is crazy.
Not really. You just have to be able to show that it is logically incoherent. And the doctrine of the Trinity is logically incoherent. Ultimately, at some point, you're going to have to retreat to the notion that this is just a mystery, which is what we see in the early discussions about the Trinity. Or you have to say, well, the scriptures demand it. We have to interpret it this way. And that's not true either. You make the choice to interpret it a specific way because the doctrine of the Trinity did not develop as part of an inductive process of trying to figure out what the scriptures mean. The doctrine of the Trinity developed as early Christians were integrating Greek philosophy and their Jewish Christian ideas about monotheism, and the philosophical side of things took priority. And what they were doing was trying to synthesize their developing idea of monotheism with this fact that Jesus is represented as independent from and also subordinate to God in the scriptures. And so what becomes the authority is the philosophical rationalization, not the scriptures. And that requires asserting logically incoherent things, such as Jesus being 100% God, but simultaneously 100% man. And these two natures are entirely unified, but also entirely distinct all at the same time. Well, how can that be? It just is. It's a mystery because I said so. So the Trinity is a question of authority. It's not a question of logic, because logically it is incoherent.
At the end of the day, maybe the Trinity is logically contradictory. But brilliant philosophers and theologians have been thinking about this and defending it for centuries.
Yes, because it's about authority and it's an identity marker. So you're going to have the best and brightest who are a part of that social identity trying to come up with increasingly sophisticated ways of defending it. But again, ultimately, there is no way to escape the logical incoherence. You have to retreat to, well, it's just a mystery, or, well, the scriptures demand it. And they don't.
You're not going to debunk it in 30 seconds.
Well, you kind of just debunked it yourself in less than 10 seconds and then retreated to an appeal to authority as a means of saying, but nuh-uh.
Nonetheless, in this case, it turns out that this fellow doesn't understand what the Trinity actually teaches. He set up a straw man.
Well, I think he was just pointing out the logical incoherence of the Trinity, which is something that you also acknowledged.
So is Jesus dependent on the Father or independent on the Father? The answer is both, but we have to properly understand who Jesus is.
So it sounds like we're probably going to be retreating to the hypostatic union, even though the hypostatic union itself is logically incoherent and must retreat to the rhetorical prophylaxis of, it's a mystery.
If we mean the eternal second person of the Trinity, who has existed for all time, then he is independent of the Father in the sense not being a dependent creature. The Bible teaches this in Colossians 1 and in John chapter 1, that God is the creator and Jesus is that God.
No, neither John 1 nor Colossians 1 identifies Jesus as the Creator God. Both of those sets of texts identify Jesus as an instrument of creation in accordance with the doctrine of the Logos Prophorikos, because they use prepositions like via aftu, through him, or en afto, in him. God is the primary agent of creation. Jesus is a secondary agent or an instrument of creation. If you take seriously what John 1 and Colossians 1 actually say.
But when Jesus takes on human flesh, we see him sweat and eat and sleep. As a human being, he then becomes dependent upon God. So he set up a straw man and failed to understand what we mean by the Trinity and actually what's meant by the incarnation.
No, the straw man is yours, because that content creator was not talking about the hypostatic union, was not addressing Jesus' dependent human nature versus Jesus' independent divine nature. That content creator was talking exclusively about Jesus' divine nature and asking, is that divine nature dependent or independent? If it's independent, then that is a second God. And what you have entirely ignored is that that is precisely how, within both Judaism and Christianity, the earliest purveyors of the doctrine of the Logos described the Logos as an independent entity. Justin Martyr explicitly says that they are distinct in number, but not in will, and calls the Logos multiple times another God. And Philo calls the Logos a second God, again, an independent entity. So this is precisely how the doctrine of the Logos began. And by Irenaeus, toward the end of the 2nd century CE, there was discomfort with that, and they returned to emphasizing the unity of the two and the notion that there was just one God. But this content creator is bringing up a point that you have not addressed, and that is the Logos dependent on God and therefore part of God, or is the Logos independent from God and therefore another God? The earliest Jewish and Christian articulators of the doctrine of the Logos said it was the latter explicitly, and you have entirely ignored that. And the fit for this video is Miles Morales.